Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you can hear me. I'm Simon Walmsley. I'm the Senior Director, Oceans and Climate at the United Nations Foundation. Welcome to our webinar, examining and exploring the role of IMO in implementing the BBNJ. As the BBNJ, otherwise known as the High Seas Treaty, undergoes the ratification process, we feel there's a real opportunity for IMO and the shipping sector per se to be proactive in identifying mechanisms for enhanced cooperation with this emerging BBNJ community of practice. And of course, this can be done using existing IMO structures and processes. The United Nations Foundation is keen to foster such cooperation and has worked with Seascape Consultants to produce a related document, a discussion paper, which will be presented today. Hopefully you've received a summary, and a full report will be available from this in the near future. Of course, we'll take into account the discussions that are about to be had today. So today we're very privileged to have such an esteemed panel in front of us to lead us in the discussion in this area. So I'll introduce them now one by one in the order that they appear, and noting the agenda in terms of what they will present. So first up, we have Frederick Hag, who's the head of office at the London Convention, London Protocol, and Ocean Affairs at IMO. Then we have Angelique Papanou, who's the lead negotiator at Oceans at AOSIS. Then we have David Johnson, who is a director at Seascape and the coordinator of the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, and he'll present the discussion paper, as I mentioned earlier. Then we have David Freedstone, who's the Executive Secretary of the Sargasso Sea Commission. And last but by no means least, Jessie Cleary, who's a geographer in the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke. And David Freestone and Jessie will do a kind of a double team and hand over to each other, because their presentations are innately related, as you will see. So briefly, some housekeeping before I hand over to Frederick. All questions, please, in the Q&A box, and Vicky Gunn from Seascape will moderate the Q&A after we've finished the presentations. And again, we're happy to receive questions post-webinar, and of course, we'll do our best to answer those questions that we haven't had time to answer in the course of the presentations and the webinar itself. So without further ado, let me hand over to Frederick. Frederick, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think there's a presentation coming up here. Let's see. Yes, I think you can. You introduced me already, so you can move on to the next slide directly, please. And yeah, well, once again, thank you for allowing me to make a few remarks on behalf of IMO at this very timely webinar, I must say. And I'd like to start by saying that we have been very fortunate and pleased to, as IMO, to be part of the discussions and negotiations over many years leading up to the adoption of the BBNJ Agreement. And as we have stated on many occasions, that this was indeed a truly historical achievement. From our end, we have maintained that the agreement will be important in reinforcing the global efforts to protect and sustainably use marine biodiversity in line with the aims of the 2030 Agenda, as well as the Kunming-Montreal Global Framework for Biodiversity. Next slide, please. From IMO, then, we've participated throughout the last decades, we can honestly say, from the early stages through the final negotiations. And what we've been focusing on in these, as IMO, as an observer to the discussions, because IMO is an observer in that capacity. It's the member states that negotiated the treaty. We provided information and statements and side events to support the process with information regarding our mandate, and provided expertise to the best of our abilities. And we believe that this is very important because as a new treaty has to operate within an existing global regulatory framework that spans across a number of ocean sectors and industries. From the perspective of international shipping and IMO, then, this is crucial, of course, since shipping is the biggest user of the ocean surface and seas, and activities range from voyages carrying the world's traded goods, to fishing, to tourism, exploration and exploitation of sea-based resources, and scientific research. So shipping is truly part and parcel of this. So, but to ensure that shipping operates safely and with respect to marine environment, we have, as an international organization, been around for a long time. And I'd like to reiterate this because I know there's a wide variety of participants in this webinar, so it's important to make this point. That IMO has been around a long time and has a very long history of contributing to the governance of the ocean. This includes not least the Marple Convention and the London Convention, which are both landmark steps towards an environmental focus in the ocean when they were adopted nearly 50 years ago. And both these treaties are of direct relevance to the BBNJ Agreement and illustrate how IMO has quite a specific mandate that does include both international shipping and the prevention of pollution from dumping of waste at sea. So I think it's important, another important aspect to keep in mind. So over the past 5 decades since these two treaties were adopted, our IMO's 176 member states and more than 130 observers have continuously strengthened our efforts to ensure protection of the marine environment, while also ensuring that the sustainable shipping industry can provide the services on which we all rely. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to remember is that in principle, the IMO regulatory framework applies to ships wherever they operate on these seas. And many deal directly or indirectly with the protection of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, because we regulate the ship, right? Wherever it is. So to further protect areas as well that might be particularly vulnerable to the impacts from international shipping, and which might be of the most relevance to the BBNJ agreement, IMO has several area-based management tools within its regulatory framework. These include and have been raised in the BBNJ framework many times, particularly sensitive sea areas, which can in principle incorporate any IMO measure that we have at our disposal to protect the marine environment. And these and many other tools are already available under IMO and can be applied also in the high seas, even if PSSAs, for example, have so far been applied only within EZs, almost exclusively. But we're also aware that there are discussions in several regions, including high seas areas where it could be possible to establish PSSAs beyond the EZ. Next slide, please. Another important aspect is that these tools and processes that we as IMO have and that are linked to the BBNJ agreement, they're not being developed in isolation. For example, the PSSA process, it draws heavily on the CBD EBSA process and criteria when you identify areas. And there are also strong links to the UNESCO World Heritage Center Marine Program, for example, and many other sectors and stakeholders. And this is part of the process of establishing IMO measures. Next slide, please. IMO's measures are effective because when a vulnerable area has been identified, they regulate the specific activity. And in this case, for IMO, then international shipping. And through this carefully crafted regulatory regime, which is there to provide a balance between the delivery of the goods on the one hand and the protection of marine environment and sustainable development. So next slide, please. In the months and years ahead, as we now move from a long period of discussion and negotiation and ratification, eventually implementation of the BBNJ agreement, we look forward to taking part in all the preparatory processes, including the PrepCom, and preparing for the entry into force. It's been a long journey to come to this point. We all know that. But I think that understanding how to apply this new agreement in practice will be crucial. And events such as this are therefore absolutely essential to build better understanding of each other, because we all come with different perspectives and different knowledge about how this treaty will operate or agreement will operate in the ocean landscape. I think only by understanding each other can we assure that the BBNJ agreement will work properly as we intend in practice, and that the various cogs in the existing machinery can work smoothly with this new instrument as well. We will continue to share our experiences and how our global regulatory framework applies vis-a-vis the BBNJ agreement, including on the high seas, of course. And we look forward to continue strengthening our cooperation within the context of the agreement with all member states, the UN family, all the stakeholders, and all those that are here for discussion today. And with that, I hand over back to you, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederick. That was excellent framing, excellent contextualization, and reminding us about the fact that you regulate the ship on its full voyage. I think that's something to really think about. And then the other thing that I picked up, which is kind of a polar opposite to that, is that don't do things in isolation. And this, again, this is what this webinar is all about, is enhanced cooperation. On that note, hope I've framed this quite nicely now for Angelique. I'll give the floor to you right now. Go ahead, Angelique. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm just going to put my clock on so I don't go too much over time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. So Frederick has very kindly provided sort of the IMO perspective. I'll give a little from the BBNJ perspective, having been in the process for a while now, but also offer some considerations as to the opportunities for enhancing cooperation. So with the BBNJ agreement, one of the main objectives of the agreement, and that's seen in Article 2, is in addition to conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, is also this idea of furthering international cooperation and coordination. Now, within the agreement, it completely appreciates that there's going to need to be an interaction between with other relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. So the shorthand for that in the BBNJ space is IFBs. So if you hear me refer to IFBs, we're talking about all these relevant legal instruments, frameworks, global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. So the BBNJ agreement, for one of the critical starting points that we need to consider when thinking about this interaction is Article 5.2, which really says that the BBNJ agreement must be interpreted and applied in a manner that does not undermine relevant IFBs. And we had very lengthy conversations about what does not undermine mean. The other article that is, of course, of relevance is Article 8. And here it creates this obligation of cooperation on parties, including, and gives examples, so including through strengthening and enhancing cooperation and endeavoring to promote objectives in decision-making bodies of other relevant IFBs. Right? So you've got this not undermining provision, and then you've got this obligation to cooperate, and ways in which you could do that is through promotion of objectives in different decision-making bodies, or enhancing, and in addition, potentially enhancing cooperation. But what does the BBNJ not do? So BBNJ does not become this almighty authority that can direct other IFBs on what to do. Instead, the design of the agreement itself creates a series of consultative processes in which other relevant bodies like the IMO would be consulted in as part of different processes, and then this obligation for cooperation. Seems simple enough, I guess, until we start to realize that there may be challenges here. There may be challenges to that obligation to promote. So, for example, one of them is whilst a decision may be taken in the BBNJ COP, there may be different membership in the BBNJ COP versus those in the COP or the governing bodies of other fora. So whilst you may have those countries taking a decision, for them to then automatically promote it in the other fora may not be the same. The politics may be different. The dynamics amongst countries may be different, and membership may be different. The second consideration, and those of you working in governments, this of course strikes very close to heart, is, as we know, those authorities or representatives of our countries that go to the BBNJ agreement may not be the same ones who attend the IMO, and as such, you may see a difference in approach unless there is serious, excuse me, serious coordination and robust national coordination nationally to make sure the same approaches are taking place in both fora. So, but then the next prep come to countries will have to consider what does enhancing cooperation look like, so that we can really look like what the opportunities are. And please, let's not forget that yes, today we're focusing on shipping and the IMO, but of course we're going to have this very similar conversation with other IFBs, with RFMOs, the International Seabed Authority. There's going to be a lot of considerations of how these different IFBs are treated, if not all the same. So here, I thought I would try and at least zoom in on one example. And I'll take the area-based management tool example. So here, as most of you know, from the shipping regime at least, there's, and Frederick's already highlighted this particularly sensitive sea area, the PSSA, and where it manages maritime activities in areas that are recognized for ecological and biological importance. And of course, these may occur in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And if they do, now that we have the BBNJ regime, where to next? I guess is a question that needs further consideration. One of the things that's worth noting is the criteria for establishing the PSSA under the IMO regime and that of the BBNJ regime are slightly different. Admittedly, there is significant compatibility between the PSSA criteria and the BBNJ Annex 1 indicative criteria for setting up area-based management tools. The differences are issues like network connectivity, cumulative impact assessments, and conceptually the vulnerability assessments are aligned but requires some further technical harmonization. So here, the measures that IMO can put in place are things like routing measures, strict application of MARPOL discharge and equipment requirements for vessels, installation of vessel traffic services, but BBNJ agreement can go further than that, right? So one of the things that we need to think about is, what are we trying to manage in this area? Is it only shipping related? Or is it broader than that? And therefore, is there a need to look at other options or alignments? The second one is there a sequencing opportunity? And this is a frequent conversation in the RFMO BBNJ discussion around, is there an opportunity to first designate it as that area as a PSSA and then move it to BBNJ later on? Are there reasons to start at IMO? Are there reasons to start at BBNJ? Are the politics different? And are we aiming for complete harmonization between the IMO and BBNJ regime? Or do we take a dual assessment track? Does it get assessed under the IMO only? And does it get assessed under BBNJ? Or does going through one suffice? So those are all things that will need to be pondered and carefully considered. I'll now move to the next point around, what does enhancing interaction and cooperation look like? And it can be, to my mind right now, I've got sort of three options. Very light touch, which is pretty much status quo. You have state parties hopping from one forum to another, having decisions that are closely aligned, mirroring those decisions, calling for joint workshops, having MOUs in place. Or we could look at something stronger, perhaps, a cooperation arrangement where all the relevant IFBs are in the same room so we can all speak to each other. And still looking at the MOU, although that is a status quo way in which regimes have been linked, what is in the detail of that cooperation? Does it include sharing of data? Does it include sharing of expertise? And the other layer of consideration is it sufficient to just be secretariat to secretariat, or do we need subsidiary bodies to be able to talk to each other? How does the BBNJ scientific and technical body be able to draw on the data systems that IMO already has in place, be able to draw on the expertise of the subsidiary bodies in the IMO? So just to end, things we do need to consider. At a minimum, how do we support this IMO BBNJ interface? We know we will need it. How will the BBNJ subsidiary bodies be able to draw on the expertise of shipping? How do we enable that? And those are considerations that are all prime and ready to be taken forward and considered at PrepCom 2. So look forward to Frederick's continued participation, but of course, other folks who engage on both regimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelique. Again, a great framing. Contextualization of the BBNJ big picture is how I've written it down here. And I think what my take home from this is that it's a balance between the not undermining clause and the obligation to cooperate clause. Of course, those of us involved in BBNJ know that. But I think it's around not just the balance, it's the mechanics of how to operate that. And Angelique brought quite a lot of questions for the discussion. I'm hoping now, lining this up for David and handing this over to David, that he might be able to answer some of those or at least begin the discussion, because this is why we've worked on this discussion paper. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon, very much, and thank you to the previous two presenters. They've certainly set the scene, and I don't need to repeat some elements. This presentation is intended to complement the draft discussion paper summary, which has already been shared, but I also give a health warning as well. My slides are a bit text heavy. I know the presentation that follows is much more well illustrated. Some of the bullet points are in my shorthand, so I'll explain myself. And it's also littered with acronyms, and I'll try and spell those out as we go. So next slide, please. First off, then, I would like to talk about a little bit about context, and I guess this is information that you already know, but we're in the regime of the United Nations Conference of the Law of the Sea, which deals with different jurisdictions and rights and obligations of states. And the new international legally binding instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction was adopted by consensus in June 2023. It comprises a package of issues, and as Frederick said on one of his slides, it is up for signature up until September, but then going through a process of ratification, and 22 parties have ratified. At least 60 need to ratify before this new instrument comes into force. Importantly, in UN speak, the IMO is a competent international organization. And I won't go through these bullet points because Frederick's already covered them through. But IMO is very well placed and also has a long history of putting in place globally binding treaties, and through a process of flag, coastal and port state control. So next slide, please. If we talk a little bit to the points that Angelique raised, cooperation and collaboration are essential in my view, and one of the conclusions of our study was that this is already enshrined in the mandate of the new BBNJ agreement, and Angelique has highlighted these two articles already. Really important to bear in mind the not undermining clause, and then the statement of international cooperation. We've already mentioned enhanced cooperation a couple of times. To my knowledge, this was derived from suggestions by WWF, and I like the way Angelique broke it down into how that might be delivered. But we see a more proactive action agenda I'm very familiar with international bodies where there's an agenda item for contributions from other international bodies. We need more than that in the context of this. And I think Angelique explained that very clearly. So the insight that our study made was that this is a win for multilateralism, and that IMO has a vested interest in being proactive to make sure that shipping interests and existing IMO structures and processes are taken on board. So if you click again, please, our first recommendation of the study was that this enhanced cooperation should take place. It has to, in the IMO context, be driven by a champion, a member state. And several of the IMO member states that represent significant tonnage have already ratified the agreement. So it might be a champion from within. I also think that this enhanced cooperation is something that needs to be spelled out, and it's very good that we're able to bring that to the table. Next slide, please. So I want to dive into the area-based management tools, including marine protected areas as well. This is a key measure of a key part of the BBNJ agreement. And as far as marine protected areas are concerned, it's been a legal lacuna, a gap in the regulation. So importantly, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, has a 30 by 30 target, 30% of the ocean to be protected by 2030. And that can't be achieved without including area beyond national jurisdiction. Feeding that are some associated scientific processes. So the ecologically or biologically significant area portfolio of the CBD is important, and some taxa-specific efforts feed into that, international important bird areas, important marine mammal areas, important shark and ray areas, and important marine turtle areas. This is core science, and it's science that informs considerations such as connectivity, which is important in terms of thinking about where networks of marine protected areas might be. To date, very limited high seas marine protected areas, only regional conventions with a mandate to do so, the OSPAR Commission in the Northeast Atlantic and CAMLAR in the Southern Ocean. But as Frederick highlighted, the IMO has its particularly sensitive sea areas, the PSSAs, with associated protective measures. And I've just highlighted traffic separation schemes there, compulsory pilotage, mandatory reporting, and areas to be avoided. It's interesting that these associated protective measures have really been associated with trying to mitigate grounding or collisions, and really with sensitive environments, coral atolls, or important shorelines. So none, as Angelique mentioned, none have yet been established in the high seas, but the Northwest Mediterranean PSSA was all about avoiding ship strikes on cetaceans. And that gives a new precedent that we might take advantage of in the high seas. So for this part 3 of BBNJ agreement, it's a legally defined process establishing these ABMTs. It has to be achieved through the COP, and as Angelique said, Annex 1 has indicative criteria, and there is a considerable match-up with the PSSA criteria. Importantly as well, a draft management plan is required for these ABMTs under the BBNJ agreement. So the insight, and we've already had it, is that there is real potential here to recognize PSSAs, to bring the two BBNJ and IMO together. Next slide, please. So if we go to recommendations, it's a two-way street. First of all, I think that PSSAs should be recognized by BBNJ. And then if we flick to the next recommendation, it should go the other way. I won't read all that out, it would take me forever, but essentially the ABMTs, as they come online with BBNJ and BBNJ agreement COP approves them, they need to be considered in due course by IMO through the relevant channels. Next slide, please. Importantly, another dimension which we haven't mentioned yet is dynamic management measures. So a lot of these areas that are important are not necessarily well served by static polygons that mark them out, partly because they are mobile and partly because they're not there all the year round. And climate change is exacerbating some of these things as well. So the high seas has ephemeral features. These are potentially sort of breeding areas or spawning areas. They happen at a certain time of the year. And it also has dynamic features that might shift location. So what we need to be thinking about is increased use of satellite remote sensing. And I note that Skylight is on the call, so that's great. That's great to see. It's using increased resolution and sensitivity and frequency of remote sensing information. The insight then, for as far as our study is concerned, is that we need to take advantage of these pioneering tools and use them to help the shipping industry contribute towards establishing a coherent network. Next slide, please. And the recommendation from that is we need to explore how IMO can collaborate with remote sensing expertise, and that might be achieved through GAZAMP or through other support. Next slide, please. So moving on to environmental impact assessments, which have been mentioned already. This is a well-established methodological tool to assess significant adverse impacts and effects. Many people will be familiar with it in terms of terrestrial or coastal developments and activities. But for me, slight departure, I guess, from what Frederick put on his slide. I think the MARPOL special areas and the emissions control areas are relevant here. And also some of the efforts to mitigate direct impacts. So environmental impact assessment is all about mitigation of impacts. And voyage planning, we've highlighted in the discussion document as well. Recognizing important marine habitat is important too, and we've made special reference to the Polar Code. So the BBNJ Agreement Part 4 is on EIA, and the obligation here is on parties. So in the IMO context, that means member states to bring forward environmental impact assessments. The BBNJ Agreement will develop standards and guidelines, and it will have a clearinghouse mechanism. So as a mechanism for sharing information. And Angelique already mentioned the scientific and technical body. This is quite a conundrum. How will international shipping be represented on this body? Will it be the Secretariat of the IMO? Will it be representatives of industry? Will it be certain flag states? Needs working through. So the insight is that there's an opportunity to highlight best practice and share expertise in terms of dealing with significant impacts. Next slide, please. And the recommendations coming from that, I've just mentioned the scientific and technical body. Next recommendation is that we should be using technology and perhaps extending that to think about migration corridors, for example, for important marine mammal areas in the high seas. And the next recommendation, thanks, is about using detailed voyage planning. I call it voyage planning plus. So voyage planning is mandatory, but there are other aspects that could be included to be a priority in terms of biodiversity conservation. And green shipping routes are an example of where some of that thinking has taken place in the climate sphere that could be extended. And WWF again have done work on blue corridors, and I know Chris Johnson is on the call. Next slide, please. So a third element is capacity building and transfer of marine technology. This hasn't been mentioned yet, but it's part 5 of the BBNJ agreement. And I think this is a huge challenge. We've got a much broader range of stakeholders involved with the BBNJ agreement, including landlocked states, developing countries, different sectors. And so that's a challenge. I think it's important to note evolving technologies in the shipping sphere. And IMO has been really good at putting in place mechanisms for capacity building, including through the Technical Cooperation Program and through specific GEF-funded and GEF-linked projects like Globalist. Annex 2 of the BBNJ Agreement sets out a whole load of different modalities of capacity building and transfer of technology. So defines what the BBNJ Agreement means. And I think the insight here is it should be about sharing shipping stakeholders' positions and building on existing efforts. Next slide. So our recommendation is that lessons learned from international shipping competence-based training programs should inform the capacity building package that has to be developed within the framework of the BBNJ Agreement. And that's really going to be important about two-way communication and raising biodiversity literacy for mariners as well. Next slide, please. So our discussion document highlighted an area that is really perhaps at the vanguard of potentially becoming a new BBNJ Agreement area. I won't take their thunder because it's the next presentation, but importantly, a whole lot of work has been done on the Sargasso Sea. And there are ways in which potentially drawing on other examples like the Northwest Mediterranean PSSA, that measures could be put in place. And David Freestone and Jesse Cleary will elaborate on that. Next slide, please. So finally, as part of this discussion document, we undertook a series of structured interviews, and it was very obvious that there is huge political will to drive this forward. We realize that there's a biodiversity and climate crisis, and as Angelique said, this is going to require additional coordination between states, between ministries, between conventions and agreements. Importantly, all the feedback we had, and it's been highlighted here as well, is that we should be working with existing instruments. However, we can be quite creative with that. For example, incorporating new areas into ECDIS. There's a great value of commercial contractual flexibility, but that really needs some understanding on behalf of charterers. If ships are going to be delayed because they've avoided sensitive environmental areas, then there's a cost consideration there as well. Also, in terms of supply chains, some reward is important, and that's come up. How do we recognize those elements of the shipping industry that are working towards the BBNJ Agreement? Can there be some sort of recognition scheme? And then amongst the scientists, particularly the cetacean scientists, they highlighted that there are different issues, particularly with cetaceans. There are endangered subpopulations of cetaceans in the same place, like the pygmy blue whales off Sri Lanka, but there are huge migratory corridors where these animals migrate to at different times of the year. And then finally, there was a very good point made about mutual understanding between science and shipping. So, for example, most shipping, modern ship engines are designed to be fuel efficient. They're designed to minimize emissions. If you start slowing them down from their optimal speed, then you might increase emissions. So you might save the whales, but you might pump more carbon dioxide and particulates into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So our recommendation here was to convene a webinar, and we're on it. So that's great. Next slide. Thank you very much, and look forward to any questions. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you so much, David. Great job in distilling all that information into 10 recommendations. And I particularly like the science side, of course. The science should inform everything. And you even mentioned GAZAMP, which we don't hear much out of IMO. I know they work in different fora, but I think the gazamp angle is a good one, and getting the science correct, doing the right things in the right places is paramount. And I also think that the satellite remote sensing as well is something to think about, and the use of existing measures, processes, etc. tweaked is what this is all about. Nobody likes to reinvent the wheel, so let's reinvent it slightly. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, David. I'll hand over to David Freestone and Jesse Cleary. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much indeed, Simon. I've got a presentation coming up, but tremendous progress so far. So thanks to previous speakers. Great, always enjoy listening to Frederick, and everybody who's been the BBNJ negotiations knows that he was an assiduous attender. So he's been one of the more collaborative of the international organizations on this, I think, right from the beginning. I loved Angelique's analysis as well. Some of the issues which we're looking at, which this study looks at, I think will highlight that. And David, as always, that was a really tremendous summary of these issues. And he's highlighted us, so I'm delighted about this. So I've titled this Vessel Traffic Through a Sensitive High Seas Area, so as not to preempt the discussion about whether it's a particularly sensitive sea area or whether it's an ecologically or biologically significant area. It is actually that. But it's we've actually been doing all these things that Simon was talking about. So that's why I'm delighted to have Jesse Cleary from Duke University with us, because he's going to talk about the remote sensing work that we've already done, and we've already sort of published a few papers about this. So next, please. So whereas this briefly, what I'm going to do is talk about where the Sargasso Sea is, why we've been looking at it for nearly 15 years now, and for 11 years we've actually had the Sargasso Sea Commission in place. It's a really important high seas ecosystem, and we selected it actually as part of a group with IUCN initially because it's got high visibility. As a student, I remember in the 60s, law student, we're talking about why people are worried about the seabed. And I remember that my professor saying, oh, there's nothing there. It's just like an arid wasteland. I mean, we know how exactly that is not the case. And pictures of the open ocean showing just endless sea is also is extremely misleading as well. So this is has got high visibility because of the floating algae, the seaweed, which is the sargassum. And it's important, this area around the islands of Bermuda, and Bermuda is one of our champions, is our lead champion in this whole venture. It's important for a number of reasons, for both ecological reasons, the cetacean, so it's important cetacean migration area, as we heard. It's important the sargassum, floating sargassum, provides a sort of nursery habitat for all the Atlantic sea turtles. It's important for commercial species, billfishes, tunas as well, big eye particularly. And it's also the only place in the world where the European and American anguillid eels spawn in an area just south, about 300 miles south of Bermuda. We don't know why. This is one of the great mysteries of the natural world, but eels are now a major economic driver. So in the sense that there's a sushi trade, most of it emanating from Asia, aquaculture farms in Asia, but they're sourcing the glass eels from the European and American eel stocks, some often illegally. So important from an economic point of view. So next point, please. So it's I've already mentioned most of this. We've got the useful for us in Bermuda's got the Bermuda International Ocean Institute has actually got 70 years more of data from collecting data from the stations there, ocean stations. They've got data on ocean temperatures, etc. Next, please. So governance, and this is obviously the important part of what we're talking about. So this is the area that we've identified, and David Johnson talked about dynamic systems, and the sargassum is moving around the whole time. So early on in the project, Duke actually identified what we agreed is now the core area of the Sargasso Sea. The sargassum is found everywhere now, particularly in the Caribbean, where it's a pest, but this is the core area. This is the home turf, and this is a core area, but it extends much wider than this, much bigger ecosystem than this. And the governance arrangement, and if you look at that area, it's actually the high seas area, so it excludes the EZs of all the member states except including Bermuda. And that fish shape, really, isn't it? This oval area is actually was declared NEBSA in 2012 by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So in terms of governance, we've heard about IMO, so that has overarching governance, and we've got very good relations with them. The Seabed Authority has potential interest in us because the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, well, I can't use my cursor on that, but to the right of the ellipse, you see that's the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and there's 3 concessions there as well. So if mine, they're only exploration licenses, but if they were to move to exploitation, then there's risks of plumes, etc. We have an MOU with the Seabed Authority, and we also have an MOU with ICAT, which is the overarching tuna organization, as well as with NAFO. And the white area is the NAFO area to the north, which just beats into the Bermuda Exclusive Economic Zone. And again, we have one of the successes is that the parties to NAFO have actually closed off all the seamounts in their area and Sargasso Sea as a result of initiative from our project. Next, please. Right. So, what are the threats? I think we should go back to that one. You just missed one. You're not getting any text. All right. Okay. So, I just look at the pictures then, right? So. The threat to the ocean everywhere. I don't know why we lost the text, but it doesn't matter. The main threats to the ocean are everywhere, right? It's climate change, acidification, plastics. You can see a turtle there chewing on something. This is contents of a seabird's stomach up in the top right. Vessels, not directly, but it's a major traffic route, and we'll see more details of that. As well as a migratory route. So the cetacean risk is fairly real. There are risks from fishing, but mostly on the seamounts. We can see that's on the left, extreme left picture. That's a picture of deep sea coral. On the right, there's one of the seamounts in the Sargasso Sea, which was bottom trawled in the 60s. Mostly by Russian trawlers. So there are threats. So there's threats from vessels in the sense of impacts from possible collisions with cetaceans. And there's a very famous example of a vessel going into Bermuda with a whale impaled on the front of the bow, and that's a kind of nightmare that I think all the vessel operators are seeking to avoid. So that's pretty important. There are also discharges of ballast water, quite legitimately, because it's a high seas area, but where there's an algae population, that has an impact. There's some evidence of exotic species as well. I mentioned the possible threat of seabed mining, etc. So next, please. So we've been working on this for about 15 years, but in 2014, we pulled together a number of states, about 15, 16 states, and 5 of them signed the Hamilton Declaration on Collaboration for the Conservation of the Sargasso Sea, and that authorizes the Bermuda government to establish the commission, Sargasso Sea Commission. And so that we've talked about bodies, IFBs. Angelique talked about that. So it's interesting because we're not an international organization because we're established by a political declaration, not a treaty. So we don't have international personality. And an ongoing discussion is whether we count as an IFB. There are 2 schools of thought. You can imagine which one I'm on. Next, please. So those are the countries which have signed already. We now have 10 government signatories. I use the word government advisedly because 4 of them are sub-sovereign entities. The Azores is an autonomous region of Portugal. Bahamas, Bermuda is an overseas territory, as is of the UK, as is the British Virgin Islands. Canada, Cayman Islands, also overseas territory. The Dominican Republic, Monaco, the UK and the US. And Monaco particularly important because it's a high seas area, so they don't have to be neighbouring states. And we also tremendous support from both the Swedish government and the French government. Next. And we have established this independent commission. So these are appointed by the government of Bermuda on the nomination of the signatory governments, currently 7. And well, I won't go through that, from the Azores, from the UK, from the Bahamas, from the US, from Canada, Bermuda, and from David Johnson himself from the UK. Next, please. And 3 years ago, 2022, we actually were given a big, relative $3 million grant by the Global Environment Facility, which is to strengthen the stewardship of economically and biologically significant high seas area. So it's using the playing on the EPSA acronym, and that's looking at the process that we're actually undertaking, and interestingly links it up with the BBNJ agreement even before the BBNJ agreement was finalized. So I'll explain that a little bit more. And it's financed with a tremendous help from the French Environment Fund as well, with a number of these are all our partners. Right, next. So what three steps? The third one is important, communication. So that's why I'm here, but also want to be anyway. So the two major steps here are, first of all, what we're calling a socio-ecosystem diagnostic analysis. This is, if you like, the baseline science case. And this is a major operation, the baseline for monitoring and for management, etc. And we're nearly finished that. So that's been an 18-month project, 18-month work. And then on the basis of that, we then put this to our stakeholders, and on the basis of that, we develop what's called a strategic action program. This is a fairly well-established GF sort of program for large marine ecosystems, but it takes on real significance or unusual significance for Sargasso Sea, because this is the first ABNJ project that GF, governance project that GF has financed. So it's using this established methodology for other large marine, usually transnational marine ecosystems to the high seas. And that will indicate, we'll then decide, and so you'll find me being a bit equivocal about what actions we might take, because it's not in my gift. I have very strong views about it, but so do a lot of other people. But it will have to be the decision of the Commission and of the signatory governments and other stakeholders to where we actually go. And obviously one of the obvious things is that we would want to go both to the IMO and to the BBNJ COP when it's established. Next. So this links us in, if you like, to what David was saying about the requirement for a management plan. And the proposal shall be based on the best available science. So this has taken us quite some time, nearly 2 years now, and we've been using the best available science, Bermuda Institute for Ocean Sciences, which is now part of Arizona State University, and they've done a fantastic study for us. Duke have also been in the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, led by Professor Pat Halpin. They've been tremendous, particularly Jesse and his colleagues as well. Imperial College London have helped us with the fishing data. Edinburgh University, which has been sponsoring the iAtlantic and the Atlas projects, also plus a lot of individual experts on whales and sargassum, etc. So next. And one of the expert witnesses, as it were, one of the expert reports that we commissioned was from Duke to actually look at the vessel traffic through the Sargasso Sea and to look at its possible impacts and possible remedial measures, which is why we move on to Jesse in a minute. So next. We've been talking already quite established collaboration with the vessel industry, largely coordinated, but in collaboration with IMO, but also with BIMCO. We've had 3 stakeholder engagement meetings with them, which we hired an independent consultant, NLA International, we talked having somebody as hands-off a consultant to actually deal this in an objective and useful way would actually maximize the benefits from this. So we had a first meeting in March last year in London at the BIMCO offices, and then we had another second meeting in December in Copenhagen at their headquarters, and then in February this year we actually had a meeting in association with some on the fringes of the BBNJ symposium organized by Edinburgh and also by Singapore government, and we got another huge range of stakeholders. So the core individuals have been involved, core companies, etc. And what we're looking at is opportunities for voluntary collaboration, gathering information, because with huge areas, we're talking about a 4 million square mile area. So without remote sensing, you just can't do anything at all. So that's the information gathering. Of course, ships are going through it. They're famous expression, ships of opportunity, but these are regular schedules. There are lots of ways that they can inform us about activities that take place quite legally and but with which we'd like to know, which might have impacts. Okay, next, please. So thank you very much. I'm happy to pass over to Duke to Jesse Cleary from Duke, who's going to talk about a little bit more, drill down a bit more detail. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, David. Appreciate the opportunity here to talk about some of the work that our lab group at Duke has done with the Sargasso Sea Commission, and also thank you to the organizers of this webinar. Our lab group at Duke, the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab, has been providing mapping and science synthesis support for the Sargasso Sea Commission and this GEF project that David mentioned. And this is a similar role that we've taken on to support the CBD EBSA process and the ongoing ISA REMP planning process. So next slide, please. So before I talk about the main bulk of this work, which will be about cetaceans and ship strike risk, we should just mention a few other potential impacts from shipping. We've talked a little bit about the disturbance of the sargassum mats, as David mentioned, a kind of a floating nursery and pelagic habitat. These larger mats can be monitored by satellite remote sensing. We've talked about remote sensing as a possible need for large high seas areas already. But it's important to note that some of the smaller aggregation forms for sargassum are not well covered by existing resolution of satellite remote sensing. So just wanted to kind of highlight that we can see elements of this pelagic ecosystem, but not everything, and to assess the impact on the larger mats from vessel traffic. Next slide, please. We also, of course, have bilge water discharge, which can also be monitored by satellite remote sensing, particularly from synthetic aperture radar. And there are several ongoing data aggregation and monitoring programs to do that. The map on the left shows a potential bilge water discharge in the Gulf Stream, adjacent to the Sargasso Sea, from the SkyTruth Cerulean program. But important to note that, as been mentioned before, that the common synthetic aperture radar sensors are not imaging the entire Sargasso Sea. A little bit hard to see in the map on the right, but the grayer areas around the Sargasso Sea are where we're imaging with this important sensor, and big sections of the Sargasso Sea are not being monitored. Next slide, please. So the bulk of the work that David commissioned our group to work on was to look at patterns of vessel traffic across the Sargasso Sea. So we had 3 years worth of data from 2019 to 2021, and we aggregated those into these annual summaries of vessel traffic. And you can see some pretty obvious commonly traversed routes going across the Sargasso Sea ellipse, the geographical area of collaboration that David mentioned. Next slide, please. And I think there's an animation here, hopefully that'll play. Yeah. So the data that we used were AIS data from Global Fishing Watch. So this is satellite-derived AIS data. Important to note that these data are not the public data that GFW releases about fishing. These data are AIS records for all vessels traversing this region. And this is the input data that GFW then uses to generate the commonly used apparent fishing effort data set that many of you will be familiar with. So we had about 68 million AIS vessel records for those 3 years. And we processed those in a variety of ways. The animation basically is just showing 1 month of that data. I don't know if you could click on that and see if it will run, but 1 month. Oh, here we go. It's a busy ocean. We could see those vessels traversing. You can see some vessels that are fishing, some pleasure craft, as well as cargo and tankers traversing the entire area. So really busy area. This is 1 month animated hourly. So there's a lot of data here, and I think we thank our colleagues from Global Fishing Watch for providing those data for this project. Okay, I think we could go back to the slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so we looked a little bit, of course, at vessel speed. So it's important to note that we, in 3 years of satellite AIS monitoring for this region. There are almost 10,000 unique vessels that were detected in that record, crossing the Sargasso Sea in those records. And importantly, even at the end of 3 years of collecting that information, there were still new vessels that had not been detected previously crossing the sea. So this kind of a dynamic mix of vessels crossing this region. The transits are evenly split between day and night transits, and the mean vessel speed is about 13 knots. I've put a threshold on this slide of 15 knots to highlight that there were 1,600 vessels over those 3 years going fast with an average speed of faster than 15 knots. And noting that at 15 knots, the probability of lethal injury to cetaceans from a ship strike rises to close to 80%. And I don't put that there as a suggested threshold, speed threshold, but just as a marker to indicate kind of a higher level of potential lethality from ship strike collision. Next slide, please. We looked a little bit at the flag states represented in those vessels traversing this region. To no surprise, the 3 most common vessels, flags of convenience, are represented there. Marshall Islands, Panama, and Liberia make up the bulk of the traffic there. And whether you sort by the number of vessels, transit distance, transit time, we get kind of a different mix of who some of the other flag states are: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malta, Germany, Bahamas. Next slide, please. And the flag states, of course, vary by the vessel types that are flagged. The GFW data, AIS data, only has a relatively coarse representation of vessel type, and I know folks on the call who are familiar with the maritime traffic will know there are a lot of different, more refined ways we could divide these vessels into classes here. But with this relatively coarse vessel traffic or vessel type schema here, the most numerous cargo vessel flag states are Panama, Marshall Islands, and Liberia. Marshall Islands, Liberia being the most common for tankers. Passenger vessels are the Bahamas and Malta, et cetera. And so this kind of just important to recognize that the flag states have a kind of a mix of vessel types that are represented here. Next slide, please. So we've got a picture of vessel traffic across the region. So linking that was a workshop that was held in May of 2024. We've already talked about this workshop series, but to describe important marine mammal areas in this region. So there was a workshop that described 43 important marine mammal areas for this region, and including one, a really large one that crosses the Sargasso Sea. And you can see on the map on the right, a really large polygon that extends to the U.S. East Coast, as well as Iceland and as far north as Svalbard. So this is there as a migratory corridor for the North Atlantic humpback whale population. Next slide, please. So I want to show a few examples of this. The majority of the North Atlantic humpback whale population migrates to the Antilles in the winter, where there's an important breeding and calving area. And it's arguably one of the largest breeding aggregations of humpback whales in the world, and definitely the largest in the North Atlantic. And so especially the area that we're focusing on here is the northern portion of the Dominican Republic. And we've got some humpback whale tracks that highlight that whales that are there for calving and breeding in the wintertime are then migrating north to the east coast of the United States, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, and as far north as Svalbard. Next slide, please. A few other maps here that are just demonstrating some state-space models that show potential routes that humpbacks are taking to these regions. And then the map on the right shows where some of these northern foraging grounds are, kind of connectivity to this important area to, again, Canada, the US, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Svalbard. Next slide, please. So we did a quick analysis of the vessel traffic just inside of this migratory important marine mammal area, just to look at any differences from the region as a whole. And we found about still 9,000 different vessels crossing this important marine mammal area that crosses the geographical area of collaboration. evenly split between day and night, very similar night transit speeds for both at about 13 knots. So again, very similar to the entire Sargasso Sea. Important to remember as we're thinking about, it's already been mentioned, we've talked about the dynamics here, that this migratory corridor is active at different times of the year, right? Mammals, humpbacks are migrating to these regions, to the Antilles in the early winter, spending time there, and then migrating in the kind of late winter, early springtime. So we do have a kind of a dynamic use of this corridor. And important also to note that there's an important marine mammal area stopover site in Bermuda, which has most of the whales that are seen there, humpbacks that are seen there, happening in March and April as they're moving north. So we've got kind of a variation of timing of mammals using these corridors crossing the Sargasso Sea. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview here that we have both concentrated traffic and shipping lanes, as well as dispersed traffic and fishing areas across the Sargasso Sea. The actors here are varied by flag state, by vessel type, by activity, by ownership. We didn't really talk about kind of corporate ownership here, but there's obviously an important link here to who's operating these vessels. Satellite AIS remote sensing of vessels is obviously a really valuable and important new monitoring opportunity. And I know we've got folks from GFW on the call and from Skylight who are working with these data. I think the transparency around those data is a work in progress in terms of linking those vessels into the operating entities and ownership entities. And so that's, I think, a work in progress. And then just reiterating that we've got migratory corridors crossing the Sargasso Sea and crossing the main east-west traffic routes that these vessels are taking. Next slide, please. With that, I'll say thank you from David and I for the opportunity here. And then I'll just, I think, hand it back to Simon to take us to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Jesse. Again, brilliant. Difficult to summarize that. There was so much in that. I mean, I've taken the best available science as I would do, the use of existing descriptions data like EBSAs, and I was interested in EBSA and REMP in the same sentence, Jesse. Of course, regional environment management plans from ISA, and that old engineering adage, you can't fix it until you can measure it, I think is really, really apt here. And finally, on the EIAs, I mean, the data you've got there, there was a big discussion in BBNJ about kind of spatial impacts from linking to EIA. But what about temporal? What about vessels going over the same voyage over and over again? And I think these data that you've got here is absolutely needed for this. And again, best available science feeding into those discussions in terms of enhanced cooperation. And we'll finish the presentations there, but I just want to say thank you so much to all the presenters. Brilliant set of presentations. And just, I hope now that we can have a good discussion, because this was just so rich. It covered everything for me. And yeah, I was very interested in everything. So thank you very much. And I'll just ask everybody to give a virtual round of applause to the presenters. I'll try not to make too much noise, but thank you so much. And on that note, I can see Vicky's spotlighted, and I'll hand over to her for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. This is a reminder to everyone on the webinar that you can use the Q&A box to ask your questions. Now is your opportunity. We've got a few questions in there already, and I see that there are some common themes emerging. So I'm going to roll some of these questions together. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes to play with here. So the first question, and already new questions are starting to pour in, but I think what I'll do is I might direct questions at an individual panelist to start with, and then others can jump in as they like. But let's take the questions that are focused on sort of institutional arrangements, I suppose we'd call it in BBNJ language, and a couple of questions on the relationship between that might be envisaged between the IMO Secretariat and the future BBNJ Secretariat. So I'll start with this one, and maybe I'm going to direct this one at Frederick. So the question is, do the panelists envision a formal or structured relationship between IMO Secretariat and the future BBNJ Secretariat to ensure coordination? So Frederick, I'm directing that one at you to start with, but others can follow.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw the question too, and I thought it might come to me, but thanks also to the other presenters. I listened and I found it very enlightening myself as well. Okay, I'll attempt to answer, but I also do want to be very IMO and state that we're still in the PrepCom phase, and a lot of these things are still being discussed and chiseled out, so to speak. So these are just my views. I've been involved in the process for a number of years. I would say what we have said throughout the process. Actually, we have a very good relationship with all parts of the UN. We are part of the UN family as a specialized UN agency, so we have established mechanisms for exchanging of information, exchange of any kind of data or information that is needed, and we are all quite aware of our mandates and roles that have been set up by the member states. So I think what needs to happen in the time leading up to the entry into force of the agreement is to understand how we can possibly improve the dialogue and the flow of information within the new context. I think the BBNJ agreement comes with an overarching perspective encompassing all sectors in a way that we as IMO, we're responsible for one slice of this ocean governance pie, and we come with that technical expertise that will not exist within the BBNJ COP. So we need to find that way how we exchange information. But I will also like to say that that's one side of it. But one very, very important part, I think, having seen the discussions over many years, is to also realize that both the BBNJ agreement and all the IMO treaties and IMO itself was set up by the same member states. But the member states sends different representatives and different types of expertise to these different bodies. So I think that there's both a need for enhancing or clarifying how can we speed up perhaps the process between the UN and sectoral entities, but also how can we ensure that within each of the contracting parties, they also have that information and is aware of the dialogues going on in the various sectoral fora. So we don't contradict each other, because this is an opportunity to really, really use the BBNJ COP as a forum for streamlining and for understanding the wider issues, but taking action where you actually have the teeth to do so in sectoral bodies as well. Sorry for a long answer, but hopefully it's somewhat helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Frederick. Would anyone else like to come in on this with their visions, their hopes, their expectations? Angelique's smiling, so I'm sure she has something to say.
Yeah, no, thanks. It's an important question, but a loaded one, Frederick. So it's a lot to target. I think the first thing to say, I think the two are not mutually exclusive, right? We don't need to choose between formal or informal. It can be both. I think would be my starting point. And then the other consideration is how formal is formal, and what does that look like? Do we have to consider whether it is MOUs and does everything have to go? So if our subsidiary bodies want to talk to each other, for example, do they have to come to the COP and say, I'm going to reach out to to IMO to get some information about this, or can we facilitate them to do this inherently, and what are the means to do that? It looks like something else when we say about informal, about formal, right? Is it an actual arrangement where everybody's in the room and we're able to have these formal discussions? And it was interesting to hear about the idea of an agenda item, for example. And then what does informal look like? Is it coffee at the Delegates Lounge in New York? Is it a meeting in one of the conference room in London and with laptops out and sharing data, or is it a formalized process? So I think there's two layers to these questions, and a lot of thinking that needs to go into what exactly we mean when we say formal, informal, but just to say that both can exist, and certainly some countries have already expressed interests for both to coexist. Thank you.
Thank you. David Freestone, I saw you had your hand up at one stage.
Yeah,
Did you?
I haven't changed my mind. It's just I have to be a bit tiresome. No, I think there's tremendous answers from both, and I think that I just have a feeling, just responding a little bit to both those points about the informal. The informal bit takes place already, right? So this is not a controlled activity, but I have a feeling that despite the fact that different people attend these different meetings, that the excitement about this agreement is such that when the COP meets, and of course, a long process, not only just for the bringing to force, but then the first meeting has got a lot of business to do before it gets onto these substantive issues. They're going to be quite cautious, I suspect. I mean, I think that the do not undermine agenda was very dominant in the early parts of the discussions, right? I think I'm delighted to balance so well by collaboration, but I think there's going to be a feeling that they won't want to be, that's my particular feeling, is they won't want to be too ambitious in the early days at least. So that the idea of, and Angelique had mentioned, though, for example, you go to the BBNJ, if you want to designate an area which is effectively a PSSA, or do you go to the IMO, I suspect they'll be cautious about those, but that's just my personal feeling.
Thank you, David. I'm going to stick with relationships between IMO and BBNJ, and a question from a David to the other David. So David Johnson, question from David Berry, who wants to ask, what mechanism exists in the IMO to start work on BBNJ activities prior to the entry into force of the agreement? In other words, should there be a special committee created under MARPOL, and is there an established procedure for this? Could start working prior to entry into force of the agreement. And actually, there are a couple of other questions, again, talking about activities ahead of full ratification.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, I think this is perhaps something Frederick would know more intimately than me, but one of the suggestions in the chat was that some form of task force might be directed at doing this, and that sounds like a good preliminary activity. I think part of the problem with our thought process is that the MEPC already has a hugely crowded agenda. So how does this fit in? Those of you that went to the last MEPC and got involved with the greenhouse gas business and survived will recognize how busy MEPC is. But let me hand to Frederick.
Yeah, I think you were quite spot on, David. It is a limitation in terms of the bandwidth we have as a very small secretariat, actually, to establish new committees or new major endeavors like that. However, and also I would say that the BBNJ is much wider than MARPOL, so it shouldn't be under MARPOL. It needs to be at some level where you actually get all aspects, including the London Convention Protocol, possibly, and other treaties as well. But there are the way IMO operates as well is that how we use our resources and our time is set by our member states and our contracting parties. So if our member states prioritizes and would like us to allocate time and secretariat resources for a specific purpose, that will of course happen. So it's a dialogue that needs to come within the membership of IMO as well on how they want to make the best arrangement to address this. But there's certainly, I like this discussion about how formal is formal and how informal, well, whatever it was. There are always informal ways of discussing, but I think there is a point made there that it needs to go beyond the coffee in the delegates lounge to something more. And there are ways of doing that through working groups, ad hoc task teams, working groups, etc. And it's good that these ideas come out now and not later. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. I'm going to move the topic along because we have a few questions about PSSAs and ABMTs. So first question, and I know David's itching to ask this, but I also want to spread the love around a little bit, so I might fire some of these at Jessie in a minute. So Sharon Livermore has asked, can the areas included in PSSAs and other IMO area-based measures in the high seas be included in 30 by 30 targets? So David, I'll fire that one at you, and Jessie, there's a follow-up question.
Thanks, Vicky. Yes, and thanks, Sharon. The brief answer is yes. So the Convention on Biological Diversity defined other effective conservation measures, and these are for sectoral efforts that ensure biodiversity conservation, but are not marine protected areas. So the PSSAs outside of existing marine protected areas can qualify towards the 30 by 30 target as an OECM. That would be my brief answer. Pass to Jesse.
Jesse, do you want to comment on that, or I can throw another a related question at you?
Related, please. That
Related,
was
okay.
a complete answer there, I think, David. Thanks.
Okay, well, you might want to hand this off to someone else anyway. So if PSSAs could be considered as ABMTs, they would need to be effectively managed, to use the BBNJ terminology. So what might that look like for PSSAs, and how could we ensure compliance?
It's a big question for sure. I mean, I think from our perspective, thinking about the monitoring of activities in those areas is a part that the remote sensing work that our lab does is a component of, I think, in terms of looking at who's operating there and how well we can actually see activities there, whether that's vessel traffic or other use of remote sensing to see the environment itself and potential impacts there. So I think monitoring is obviously a really important part of how that management activity takes place.
David Freestone.
Yeah, sorry to, but I just think that's a tremendous question, and it's like that's really what BBNJ is added value, right? So if you go to IMO, IMO will make sure that there's a flag state responsibility for making sure that whatever measures you go are complied with, but the management issue is a BBNJ, and that's where we really have this cumulative added value from the BBNJ agreement, because if you then subsequently go to BBNJ, you can take the management plan that will include all the IMO requirements, but it's actually take it further. So just to comment.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else got something to add to this? Otherwise, I have, Frederick, please.
No, I thought I could add. I think it's a really, really good question. And we get that quite a lot. And I think it's important to remember that not all compliance is someone patrolling next to the ship and monitoring its location all the time. It's about voyage planning. It's about understanding where the vessel has been or where it's going and which route is taken, for example. We see that when we have areas to be avoided in PSSAs, you can follow AIS traffic and see how ship traffic diverts around the area as it should, right? So I think that's really, you have to think of it in that context as well. And also, just to make that point that neither IMO and I suspect not the BBNJ COP will have a compliance enforcement mandate. It's with the contracting parties of the member states to actually make sure that their vessels or whatever measures they have agreed to under the BBNJ agreement are complied with as well. So I think, or at least we need to keep that kind of conversation as well there when we discuss. Thank you.
Okay, now Simon, I'm going to beg your indulgence because I've got two more questions to ask, and then we'll wrap. So the first one actually came through on the chat rather than in the Q&A, and it's an open question for anyone to jump in on. It's an extra bonus question. So the question is, can IMO play a role in enhancing the use of traditional knowledge and supporting the general inclusion of local communities and local peoples? So anyone want to stick a hand up for that one? Told you it was a bonus question. David Johnson.
Well, I haven't got a very good answer. It's a good question, and it's something that the BBNJ will need to struggle with. But I think it's important to bear in mind that BBNJ agreement is, and indeed under UNCLOS, is part of the common heritage of humankind. So it's all about inclusiveness. Whether we can attribute traditional knowledge to some of these areas which are far off shore is something I don't think that's really been captured yet. But colleagues such as Mario Vieros and IUCN are dealing with this and hoping to gather information. And it links to species, for example, that migrate long distances and that traditional knowledge has understanding of. So again, it's an area of research, but I appreciate that's not a very good answer.
Thank you, David. Frederick.
Sorry, me again. But I completely agree with David. I just also want to add that these aspects are, when PSSAs are established, the aspects are taken into account, of course, and when you define vulnerabilities and the criteria in that process. But looking at international shipping, it may not always be obvious, but maybe this is also where the BBNJ agreement will add a lot of value to what we do. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, loads of really interesting questions have come in, but I think we're going to have to take them offline because we're running out of time. But there is one question that I wanted to direct to David Freestone, please, and that is a question about whether the Sargasso Sea Commission has encountered any challenges concerning logistics of collaborating with different IFBs.
So this isn't even Chatham House rules either, right? So
Answer at your peril.
Not with the IMO, I have to say, although we've done a couple of side events a long time ago, probably even before Frederick's time, which we got a lot of interesting reaction from. I don't know if you've ever collaborated with a large RFMO, but it's a bit like herding cats, right? So that's basically no ill will. The secretariats have been fantastic. We're very proud of our ICAT MOU, which I think we're one of the few organizations actually being able to conclude an MOU with ICAT. But just to give you an example, we put forward a proposal. It was considered by the Secretariat. The Secretariat amended it, sent it back. It went to a plenary session for sort of principle. It was agreed. We went back with the final text, and 2 states objected at that point. I mean, it's like, well, where were these guys at the first? It's really difficult, and the bigger organization, like 56 members, is it ICAT? So it is really difficult. But having said that, we are actually, I think we attend the meetings, we're very active there. So not really. I think that there's been a major sea change in people's approach to the BBNJ agreement. Initially, a lot of suspicion, etc. That was driving the do not undermine kind of agenda, particularly for RFMOs. Now I think everybody's there. Everybody's sort of aboard, and the secretariats are aboard. I was at a meeting in Singapore. There was a recounted story of by the colleague from the Netherlands of Camelar, and were refused to even give time to discuss the BBNJ agreement. So it's not home and dry, but there's a major change. I think certainly in the secretariats, and I'm sure the countries themselves will come around as they ratify.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, then I'm going to hand back to Simon, and thank you all for your answers.
Thanks so much, Vicky, for moderating that, and again, thank you all again for answering the questions. Again, I'm not going to try and summarize, other than to say that was a real rich discussion. And I'll pick out a few things as I would do. I think the BBNJ added value really stuck in my mind to kind of oil the wheels. And I think that in these discussions, that's beginning to happen. We're beginning to get into the nitty gritty of how you might operate a PSSA system and APMs. And I think the more of this that goes on before the first very busy COP, the better. And I'll stop there, other than to say we intend to continue this series of discussions onwards, and I hope to have similar events at the next PrepCon. We'll do our best to answer all those unanswered questions, and we'll also do our best to have the full report to you in the very near future. And other than that, thank you all very much for your participation. Give yourself a round of applause, and we'll stay in touch and hope to see you in the very near future. Thank you. Bye for now.
Great job. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Really good.